Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and attentive people who are regulars on my channel will have already noticed what's out here and already know exactly what's coming. So without even needing to announce which systems these are, I bet you a lot of you already know that what we're looking at here are my two oldest active systems. These have African night crawlers living in them. And for the past few feedings, they've been getting stuff that's all been geared towards a nice, easy harvest. Small particle size foods, sort of like my worm chow that you see here, or coffee. Coffee's another staple food item, but today they're getting another additional special treat, which is going to go hand in hand with these fancy devices that you see here. These are little partitions that I like to put up into my systems when I transition from everyday composting to migration. And during the last check-in, we made reference to taking some sort of steps to try to get the worms separated from their lovely castings. And it wasn't really decided what that method would be. I mean, we could have just come in here and started scraping material off the top. And, as a result of that, any worms on the surface sensing the bright lights would instinctively just dive down into the material, and you just kind of repeat that same exact process over and over and over again until you've driven all the worms really down deep into their material, and at the same time scooped up and harvested their lovely material. And then you've got yourself a pretty quick turnaround on separating the worms. The approach that I generally like to use is quite the opposite in terms of turnaround time. It's the migration method, which I've opted for here today. And today on day 300, it seemed like a nice round number to do it on. I mean, last time we were in here at day 290, we already hinted at the high likelihood of us coming back in only 10 days, since it was going to be the 300th day of service for these systems. So it's not too fancy, and you can already imagine how it kind of plays out. We make room for a horizontal migration feeding zone at the edge of the bin. I put this out here since it's quite clearly material that the worms could navigate through. The whole idea is to keep the castings free of any of the materials that I might use to build the feeding zone. So the whole intent of those is just to, end up with nice, clean castings. So I thought that we would build up the bedding for the migration zone using well-seasoned existing materials that we could collect right from the top of the bin. So all this stuff that's been sort of sitting out near the surface, I think, is excellent material to use as the bedding in a horizontal migration feeding zone. I've got other stuff too. I've got my prepared bedding, just a little bit of it remaining here, not much, so we'll use up probably all of this. And I was also going to just bundle up the food into pieces of newspaper that I've torn into little squares. So we'll see what we could do about delivering the bedding and the food together. And there was also, besides this nice seasoned bedding that we collected off the top surface, my idea was to actually go through the feeding zone from last time. So that coffee filter that we found out here in the beginning was just indicating to us where the last feeding had been, which was right down the middle, as it usually is. And one thing we thought that might be nice for the worms to get, along with their coffee and worm chow, was some supplementary bedding to go with that feeding. In that case too, it was just reusing top covering paper, I believe, some top covering, even feeding zone indicators, whatever the case may be. But I was skeptical as to whether or not we would be able to come back here and find any of that, because there's just, first of all, such a shortage of any sort of carbon-rich bedding type materials that the worms could nibble on. So any of that suddenly showing up, especially where the feeding zone is almost certain to get eaten up. And the other thing is that these being African night crawlers, they also do seem to have a tendency to really want to eat that sort of stuff. So we did a really thorough excavation here of the feeding zone, now, thinking that we might find some little pieces of paper. I don't even remember. Did I collect this from out here? Is it even paper? Is it a piece of leaf? Whatever it was that we included down in the feeding zone last time as supplementary bedding, it's history. So I got a funny feeling it's going to be kind of a goose chase, a wild goose chase, trying to track down any leftover paper. I don't know. I'm not getting that same sense of crowded feeding zone. And maybe because of that, we're actually seeing some leftover bits of newspaper already from the last feeding. Stuff that was put in there, supposedly, as supplementary bedding. So let's include that as our little find for this excavation. I don't know if we'll find much more. Perhaps that was just a fluke. Let's just complete our excavation and inspection of the last feeding zone. See what we could come up with, if anything. Big piles of worms. Perhaps they're still working on some of the stuff we gave them 10 days ago. It's hard to say. Otherwise, why would they all just be hanging out there together? It's not like moisture came in with any of that stuff, because the food is all dry. The coffee, for the most part, even though you might feel it to be damp to the touch, I kind of treat that as almost like a dry feeding. It's not like juicy. It's not going to kick off a bunch of moisture. It's just got some moisture content. None of it will remain after the worms eat the coffee itself. So, okay. So I was just curious. So we've now indulged my curiosity, and we've collected a little bit of bedding material that we could use. And I'm thinking we're going to put the feeding zone over on the side that's furthest from me, I believe. So before we excavate that side and set it up with our delicious pumpkin treat, I'd also like to do a quick inspection of the material that's closer to me on the opposite edge. At the same time, kind of giving it a good little till. Here and there you might notice me pulling out little chunks of leftover food bits. That was a piece of corn cob, I think. So why not remove it and just include it with the feeding zone? The whole idea for this stuff is for it to be clean, you know. So there too, any sort of larger chunks of material like that stick I just bumped into, I guess within reason, you know, you could really start picking all kinds of stuff out of here, but obvious things that are not meant to be part of the castings and easy enough to just pull out, at this time seem to be good candidates for removal. Alright, material definitely seems nice. I don't think we found much other than a little piece of stick, a little piece of paper, or whatever it might have been, maybe a corn cob or other chunk of food here or there. Big enough things that I think we'll be able to pretty easily exclude. Perhaps screening the material later to get rid of it, but at this point not worth trying to hunt down and eliminate by finding them all and removing them by hand manually. We'll just screen that stuff out at a later point in time. Here too, I don't know, little bits of something, possibly tomato skins or whatever they were. Over here I see I saw pot worms, lots of little tiny white worms, much smaller than the composting worms. And over here, got ourselves a nice little collection of wormies hanging out. Alright, very distracting, a little too much fun here. Let's once again move our little collection of bedding materials that we're going to use to set up our horizontal migration feeding zone and get the thing set up already, and let these little wormies be. And more importantly, let's let them start into their migration out of their lovely castings over into the collection area, or the horizontal migration feeding zone, whatever you want to refer to it as. But functionally it is basically got the idea of being the collection area. So you want the worms, as many of them as possible, over there. So there's motivations. There's the whole concept of luring them out of the material that they're in by laying out lovely pumpkin, fresh bedding, perhaps even a little bit more moisture than is present in the existing material. however you bait the hook, it's up to you. Whatever you use, your own availability of resources would probably heavily dictate what you end up using as bedding and food. So I think we've somehow managed to make a little bit of room over here, and you can definitely sense me slowing down here as I do this. I believe I could feel it because I'm a little panicky piling material this high distinctly above the rim of the container. I just don't have a lot of room to work in here, you know. Perhaps we did sort of go a little bit too far in terms of how much material we've ended up creating with these wormies in here over the past 300 days. The amount of material they made is nice. It's what you want, you know. You want a whole bunch of castings in the end, obviously. But I also value the space in which to work, you know. Always leaving a little bit of that unused, specifically for what we're doing right now, is needing to work in the system and just needing space to move the materials around without having to worry to death about spilling it. So here we might have taken it to the limit. I think we're still okay as far as having enough space to operate, but we are going to be careful. I hate to suddenly make myself a whole bunch of extra work just because I got impatient. It's probably worth the attention to just go slow and get it right the first time, basically. And don't make a mess that you need to clean up after yourself. All right, almost done. Let's clear out as much as we can. We're not making these horizontal migration feeding zones huge. They're just going to be, I don't know, perhaps the width of my hand, if that. Doesn't need to be much more than that. And then as we backfill this unused space over here, the whole level of the system will come back down and I'll feel a lot safer. But you know what? I got an idea. I gotta go get something. I will be back. 1 minute. Here we go. This is my idea. I thought we could use these as little standoffs and spacers, and they'll definitely collapse and compress as they dampen and as the worms move in and the weight above presses down over time on it. So we'll start them out as creating little air pockets, but those air pockets will vanish. The overall level of the material definitely drop. And right there, I think that's going to somewhat dictate the size of our feeding zone. I didn't really want them to be much bigger than that, so I'm content. And now we can start coming in with bedding. And, you know, might as well start right off with creating little food bundles. Oopsie doopsie. All right. Paper's a little bit fragile, I gotta be careful. At this point, I think it is a good idea to actually start backfilling against the cardboard and allow the cardboard to take its position now that there's material on both sides that can hold it up right, and that further gives us a sense of how big our feeding zones are going to be. Don't need to be terribly big. Now, in with some of my prepared bedding, I believe next. I didn't think all that newspaper would go so quick, just bundling the food, but it did go pretty quick. And let's see. We've got some collected material over here in the corner. Almost forgot about that. Let's make sure we put all that to good use. All of this stuff is coming in with worms, whoever are already in the stuff. Nice seasoned material that the worms will feel really comfortable in. Gradually all the material around it will also break in, so to speak. And let's see here. Don't have much of this remaining. Perhaps another half a handful into each system. See, a good many leaves are used to make this bedding. It's prepared with cardboard, paper, shreds, leaves, moisture. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Don't forget, we've still got worm chow, coffee, so why don't we get right into putting some of that stuff in. For whatever reason, the coffee in my feedings always manages to go in right before the worm chow. Perhaps here we'll alternate the order a little bit and try to apply it in a different sequence. I'm starting to wonder if perhaps even adding a little bit more backfill at this point would help these feeding zones remain where we want them. And you might have noticed I'm not really trying to cram any material up against this cardboard. I'm really loosely backfilling. Everything that's up against the cardboard is deliberately really nice and loose and airy, so that it's easy for the worms to get through and get over to. But I think what we've got here is a pretty nice setup. We even had some, we even had some nice seasoned top covering material, newspaper out here too, which we can utilize. And since we've got replacement feeding zone indicators that come along with the coffee treat that they're getting still, we can repurpose the old ones to go right down into the feeding area. Here again, I wonder if this is a good little place to put a little bit of this pulverized, oops, no feeding zone indicator over there. Let's see. Oh yeah, we've still got a whole bunch more material we can use over here. Awesome. Oh, we did have a feeding zone indicator. Here we go. That can go in over here. And was I unfair? Did we need to split this off? I forget. I don't know. Wasn't really keeping track. So this will be like a nice, almost like a vapor barrier here, extra material to help keep the moisture down in that feeding zone from all that juicy pumpkin. And yeah, haven't even put the coffee in here. So maybe here's a good place to excavate the old feeding zone indicator so it can become more of like a top covering here. I don't know. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. I can't explain what I'm doing. I'm just doing my best to make sure I've included all the desired ingredients in the feeding zone, and I think we could probably leave it at that. Let's level off the backfill and just all the material in the systems in general. We've definitely come up pretty high to the rim here. All the material's nice and loose. It'll make for the really easy movement of the worms through the stuff, hopefully. And you know, at least we're covering up the worm chow that we just laid down for them. Try to put these coffee filters to some sort of good use. I guess just by part of it not being covered, these little flaps that are up against the wall here, those are not going to get covered by the top covering plastic, I believe, and those will remain sort of dry. Hopefully the rest of it over here, though, by being covered in plastic, will result in being nice and moist. Most of the system will be covered by I wanted to try to capture that little chunk of material there before it ended up lost. So yeah, I want to try to cover up pretty thoroughly here. See if we can help the moisture sort of remain in here. Let this stuff remain nice and comfortable until the worms get accustomed to what's happening over there and sort of catch on to the abundance of moisture and delicious foods, and unknowingly do our bidding by moving over there. I'm even wondering if perhaps leaving a deliberate edge out here to let the stuff start drying a little bit, because I think at some point, in line with what I mentioned earlier, which was by trying to set the stage for the migration by not only luring them, I think I started into the concept of luring the worms over by creating a nice comfortable place to be. There's also the other way to sort of nudge them along, almost like repel them from the existing stuff, and I think that would eventually lead us to covering this stuff out here in such a way that it can dry a little bit more. But for now, we're going to allow for the moisture retention, let this stuff break in. Eventually, that will end up stuff that the worms really want to be in. They'll come over in droves, gradually exiting their finished casting. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.